Hello, everyone. The ships were loaded, the contracts were signed, the pork was on its way, and then bam, 12,000 metric tons. Cancelled. Overnight. No warning. No explanation. Just a quiet bulletin tucked between market updates. China cancels U.S. pork shipment. The timing impeccable. The implications potentially catastrophic. But why now? Why this specific shipment and why the silence? We're not talking about a delay. This wasn't weather. This wasn't logistics. This was a clean, deliberate surgical cut. And the meat was already bought, slaughtered, packed, chilled, paid for. Which raises the real question. What did China know that the rest of us didn't stick around? Because this isn't just about pork. This may be the opening shot in an entirely different kind of war. At exactly 2:42 a.m. Beijing time, on April 18th, a directive was issued to Chinese importers. $12,000 metric tons of U.S. pork already in transit was to be canceled, not rerouted, not delayed. Canceled outright. The order, verified by both Bloomberg and Reuters, triggered an immediate suspension of port clearance operations in Ningbo and Dalian, where the cargo was scheduled to dock. No public explanation followed. But this wasn't routine trade noise. This was premeditated. According to Chinese customs data, this was the largest pork order canceled mid-shipment in over 5 years. Worth roughly $35.4 million at April's average market price of $2,050 per ton. And here's the puzzle. Why cancel pork that was already paid for, processed, and en route? But what makes the move more strategic than spontaneous is what China did next. 3 weeks earlier, on March 25th, the Trump administration imposed a 172% countervailing duty on all pork imported from China, citing findings from a USDA investigation into alleged illegal subsidies and veterinary irregularities. Beijing didn't retaliate with matching tariffs or threats. It responded with silence. And then surgical cancellation. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian refused to tie the cancellation to the U.S. tariffs. But internal briefings reviewed by the South China Morning Post point to retaliatory strategy modeled on precision decoupling doctrine. This was not just about pork, says Dr. Hao Yu, trade analyst at Fudan University. It was about showing the U.S. that even legacy commodities are no longer safe. But if this was merely a slap on the wrist, why were buyers in Brazil and Spain celebrating by morning? The impact wasn't symbolic. It was structural. According to the National Pork Producers Council, NPPC, the cancellation created an immediate backlog of nearly 26 million pounds of pork, the equivalent of 110,000 market-ready hogs, flooding into domestic supply chains already buckling under seasonal oversupply. The hardest hit, Iowa, North Carolina, and Minnesota, which together produce nearly 60% of U.S. pork exports to China. The Iowa Farm Bureau estimates direct losses from the cancellation at $9.7 million in state. But the cascading effects, plummeting auction prices, overcapacity at processing plants, layoffs, could balloon that number threefold. In Worth County, a pork processor laid off 117 workers within 48 hours of the news. This isn't just a disruption. It's a vacuum, says Chris Novak, CEO of the NPPC. And into that vacuum, new suppliers are moving fast. On April 19th, the day news of the cancellation broke, Tyson Foods shares dipped 4.3%, while Hormel Foods, another pork heavyweight, saw a 3.1% drop. Yet analysts weren't aligned. A city research memo issued that morning flagged the cancellation as an isolated retaliatory gesture. But Morgan Stanley took the opposite view, warning of a structural pivot in Chinese protein procurement. The divergence highlights the problem. Markets are still viewing agricultural exports through short-term volatility, not geopolitical risk. And that's a blind spot. The CME Lean Hog Futures Index fell 6.5% in 72 hours, its sharpest weekly drop since the 2020 supply chain lockdowns. Markets are pricing this like a one-off, says Rabobank's global protein strategist Chen Junpon. But China is signaling a long-term shift. The question is, where's that shift headed? While American pork sat idle in refrigerated containers, Brazilian and Spanish exporters surged ahead. According to Brazil's Ministry of Agriculture, pork exports to China rose 28% in April alone, with Sao Paulo-based BRFSA filling emergency procurement contracts typically reserved for U.S. suppliers. Spain's Interpork, the country's pork export council, confirmed a 23% spike in Chinese orders year over year, with new fast-track clearance protocols signed in Shanghai just days after the U.S. shipments were canceled. In total, Brazil and Spain now account for 48% of China's imported pork, compared to just 19% from the U.S., down from 33% in 2023, according to China's General Administration of Customs. This is not trade diversification. It's strategic replacement, says Alicia Garcia Herrero, chief economist for Asia-Pacific Ethno-Tixis. The U.S. is not being outcompeted, it's being outmaneuvered. So here's the question. What happens if China keeps canceling? Do we adapt or collapse? Drop your take in the comments, because we're about to explore something no one's ready to admit. While no official ban has been issued, multiple U.S. pork producers have reported unexplained delays in customs approvals at Chinese ports since mid-March. According to internal USDA dispatches reviewed by Bloomberg Smithfield, Foods confirmed that 2 of its shipments were held for extended inspection, while JBS USA said China had suspended communication on several pending contracts. Behind the scenes, Beijing has quietly updated its import protocols to require supply origin transparency and biosafety alignment with standards not currently met by some U.S. facilities. The result? A silent filtration mechanism that targets American exporters without triggering WTO retaliation. Trade attorney Daniel Portman, who has advised on U.S.-China disputes since the 2018 tariff war, calls it a de facto blacklist under the cover of technical compliance. If this process expands, it may represent not just a tactical snub, but the beginning of sector-by-sector economic disengagement. And if pork is first what's waiting in the wings, the economic backlash didn't stop at lost exports. As of April 22nd, USDA cold storage data shows U.S. pork inventory at 634 million pounds, up 14% year over year. Wholesale prices for pork bellies and loins dropped 17% in just 8 trading sessions, forcing retailers like Kroger and Costco to introduce unseasonal discounts to clear inventory. But this oversupply is rapidly outpacing domestic consumption. A recent Wells Fargo agricultural report warns that sustained export withdrawal could compress farm gate margins by over 22% within 1 quarter. Smaller producers, already burdened by rising feed and energy costs, may not survive a prolonged price collapse. In Missouri, at least 6 independent hog farms filed for Chapter 12 bankruptcy in April alone, citing inventory overhang and price suppression. If this cancellation sets a precedent, the U.S. food chain may buckle not at the grocery store, but at the farm gate. Yet pork may be the opening act, not the main performance. Beijing's latest five-year food security plan, quietly approved in January, outlines a target to reduce reliance on strategic food imports from politically unstable suppliers by 40% by 2028. While the U.S. isn't explicitly named, analysts from ING and Rabobank interpret the language as a direct reference. Since 2023, China has quadrupled domestic investment in agritech, built over 80 million cubic meters of new grain storage, and secured long-term pork and beef contracts with Brazil, Spain, and Argentina. At the same time, its soybean imports from the U.S. fell by 25% in Q1 2025, replaced by shipments from Brazil and Paraguay, according to customs data verified by Reuters. This isn't reactive, it's methodical. China is treating food security the way the U.S. treats semiconductors, says Darren Friedrichs, founder of Setonia Consulting, and that means less vulnerability to any U.S. export disruption, intentional or not. But if pork is strategic, then the next moves may cut even deeper. In 2024, China bought $15.6 billion in soybeans, $5.1 billion in corn, and $2.2 billion in beef from the U.S., making agriculture the second largest U.S. export sector to China after semiconductors. But Q1 2025 data reveals sharp contractions. Soybean imports from the U.S. dropped 26%, corn down 33%, and beef cut in half, while Brazilian and Argentinian agricultural imports surged by double digits. Bloomberg reports that COFCO, China's largest state-owned food importer, is actively unwinding contracts with American grain suppliers through quiet non-renewals and bulk resourcing from Mercosur partners. At the same time, China signed a landmark food security deal with Russia in April that includes 20-year preferential import terms on barley, wheat, and beef, effectively locking in alternatives to U.S. producers. These aren't isolated trade shifts. They're contingency plans for a broader economic decoupling, quietly executed through agriculture, one commodity at a time. So if pork, soybeans, corn, and beef all start vanishing from China's order sheets, what happens next? This wasn't just a missed sale. It was a message. And not just to farmers, but to every industry tethered to China's demand. Because when 12,000 metric tons of pork get canceled mid-shipment, that's not logistics, it's leverage. So now we have to ask, if China can phase out U.S. pork this surgically, what happens when they target semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, or even treasuries with the same silent precision? The next cancellation might not show up on a bill of lading. It might show up in bond yields, in Wall Street sell-offs, or in supply chains grinding to a halt. So before you scroll away, ask yourself, what if the real decoupling isn't loud or fast, but one quiet cancellation at a time? And if that's true, then the biggest move China is preparing still hasn't been made. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen. Goodbye, and see you in the next programs.